our very interesting and exciting final keynote of the day on the very intriguing topic of AI for an age of planetary transitions. Our speaker oversees global impact initiatives at Planet, working to ensure the company's data, products, and services achieve their highest humanitarian and sustainable development and scientific potential. He works closely with all parts of the company, as well as with the United Nations, NGOs, philanthropists, conservation organizations, and disaster response entities to incubate and deliver new forms of social and environmental impact. He is also the author of the best-selling book, Resilience: Why Things Bounce Back. He received a BA in Cognitive and Computer Science from Vassar College and did graduate studies in Foresight at the University of Houston. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Andrew Zolli, Chief Impact Officer at Planet. Come on, Andrew.
Hello. Whew. What time is it? What time is it? Anyone know the time? 5:25. 5:25, the peak learning hour of the day. I would like to congratulate you and your bladders for surviving this incredibly intense and elongated day. My name is Andrew Zolli. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you today. Just out of curiosity, can I ask how many aerospace engineers are in the room today? 4 of you. Well, for the others, I'd like to tell you a story about satellites. Now, let's see if that works. Boink. I work at an organization with hundreds of the world's most talented rocket scientists, aerospace designers, satellite engineers. And one of the things that you learn when you're building a satellite is that in addition to whatever else the instrument has to do, whether it's take pictures of the Earth or communicate or look out at the stars, in addition to that, you have to cover the instrument with the satellite with all kinds of other instruments. And those instruments are there to measure the forces that are acting on the satellite as it's operating in space. And you have to measure the forces of change that are acting on the satellite at least as often as those forces are unfolding. Otherwise, that satellite could begin to spin out of orbit, and by the time you find out about it, it becomes irrecoverable. Does that make sense? Well, I have news for everybody in this room. You live on a satellite. It just happens to be going around the sun instead of the Earth, and it has 8 billion astronauts on it. And likewise, in an era of planetary scale change, we have to measure the forces of change that are operating on our satellite at least as often as those forces are unfolding, or else we risk going into an uncontrolled spin. And we call that uncontrolled spin the poly crisis, climate change, the sustainability crisis, ecocide, the war over resources and water and all of those forces that are happening on the Earth. Right? Those are the forces of change that we all have to think about. So we might start with a just basic observation. What do we know about them today? Hold on a second. I'm still figuring out where I have to point my clicker. Our colleagues at the Stockholm Resilience Center developed a model for understanding the most foundational forces that are acting on the planet, the fundamental systems that are required for life to flourish, for you to be able to respirate and to coexist with all of the other parts of the integrated biosphere of the planet. These 9 planetary systems is called the Planetary Boundaries Framework. When they first did the analysis, these dozens of Earth system scientists, they found alarmingly that 2 of the 6, I don't know what I'm doing. Hold on a second. Make me pretty. Thank you. Okay, did it work? No. When they first did the analysis in 2019, they found that 2 of the 9 systems that make it possible for life to flourish on the Earth had exceeded the planetary tipping points that allow the planet to regenerate those systems interannually and make it possible for us to continue to live. Then when they did it several years later, they found that 4 of those systems were being pushed past their planetary tipping points. When they did it in 2023, they found that 6 of the 9 systems. This is like cutting the pieces of the cord that make it possible for civilization to occur. There are many, many dimensions of that story, but I'll give you just one. If we look in the history of life, there have been 5 times that we've been able to identify that all of life on Earth almost perished completely. 5 great extinctions, and there is real scientific debate right now on whether or not we're living through the 6th extinction. The earliest days, a mass die-off. The last time it happened, you might remember, a meteor hit the Yucatan and all the dinosaurs died. If we made the school play of the dinosaurs and the meteor, who would be cast as the meteor? Us. We are the instrument of destruction. So it's possible that we're living through the 6th extinction. But it is also the case that we are living through the 2nd Renaissance, a massive explosion of capability, capacity, intelligence, the emergence of this self-compounding wave of the ability to lower the marginal cost of intelligence applied to every material problem that exists. And the 6th extinction and all the rest of those things are nothing but a bundle of billions of complicated problems. So if you are lucky enough in this room, if you are a student, if you are a startup entrepreneur, if you're working for a government, if you are lucky enough to work on some of those tools on the right, you have not just an economic but a moral obligation to align them to the problems on the left. Because we all have a universal obligation to protect the capacity for life to flourish on the earth now and for future generations. So, how do we do that? Well, first of all, we have to understand the consequences and interconnectivity of the problem. I'll just give you this one example. This is in agriculture. Okay, so here we are in agriculture. Just start with this. We have about 8 billion people on the planet. I mentioned that now. We're adding another billion people to the population of humanity in the next 10 years. And that is driving profound impacts and profound need for increases in agricultural productivity. We need more land to feed everybody. And that, in turn, puts pressure on the forest, the field and forest boundaries. The principal thing that's driving deforestation around the world is the need for us to make food, basically. It's to grow our food and to take care of our livestock. But as we do, we create more and more interactions between livestock and wildlife and humans, and we create new forms of pandemic risk. And as we shrink the forests, we increase our climate risks because the forests are major sources. So where do we interrupt that system? Well, the place I'll pick is in agriculture. So again, how do we do this in agriculture? We take the ability to look down at every agricultural plot on Earth and assess what it needs in real time. And by using the power of information to increase the information intensivity of agriculture, by applying just what's needed, exactly where it's needed, and exactly when it's needed, we can reduce its socio-ecological intensivity. And in order to do that, we need to actually understand what's happening in every field on Earth. But we're starting to see exactly that. I'll just show you. This is what's called a precision sprayer. It's actually being guided by a satellite in real time to produce only and to deliver only the amount of fertilizer that's needed to a crop, to increase its productivity by about 10 to 15%, which is 10 to 15% fewer trees you have to cut down to feed the next group of people. Now, entirely that system is driven by AI. 100%, everything I just told you. But it connects very powerfully to this story because every time you don't need to use a gallon of fertilizer, or a liter of, I'm sorry, I'm in Canada, a liter of fertilizer is made with heavy industry using petrochemicals. It has to be delivered to the field on a truck. It has to be sprayed and applied by a machine. It runs off those crops and into the river basin. I live in Minnesota, where it comes down through the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico, and there's so much nitrogen fertilizer in the Gulf of Mexico right now that there's a space the size of New Jersey in which nothing can live. It's anoxic. It's completely antithetical to life. It's like being in outer space. So if we can reduce the need for nitrogen fertilizer and still feed this ever-growing planet, maybe we get through this complicated transition. And this story is happening over and over again. I'll give you another example. This one is from Google. Google, one of the early successes of Google was, this was a DeepMind story, I know we've got DeepMind people here today, was to apply the tools of machine learning and deep learning to the energy utilization of their data centers. And they were able to achieve 40% improvements in the energy efficiency of their own compute. But the thing that's interesting is that algorithm has now escaped into the world in ways that is now going to be connected to the physical plants of cities. This is one of the things that Google's working on, so that they can drive efficiency in the energy utilization of all of that built infrastructure. This is among all the alarming and understandable concerns about the energy utilization of training large models and deploying deep learning systems, which I don't want to discount in the slightest. It is in doing this that there is some hope that that massive energy investment is proven to be worthwhile. So what I want to spend the rest of my time today talking to you about is how we do this for the Earth itself. Now, I work for an organization called Planet. We've deployed the largest constellation of Earth-observing satellites in history in a giant ring around the Earth. So if you can imagine, you're the sun shining this way. Here's the Earth spinning around like this. You might remember this from grade school, right? The Earth goes like this. It is also not flat, for anyone who's curious. So it's spinning around like this. These are satellites that spin from pole to pole, and as the Earth turns sideways, they act as a line scanner and image the entire surface of the Earth every day at about 3 meters per pixel. That's not enough to read your newspaper, but it's enough to see every tree crown, every road, every field, every forest, everywhere, every day. It's 40 terabytes of Earth information about the whole planet. Now, we have other satellites that can zoom in, not everywhere, but anywhere on Earth multiple times a day to capture fine detail when there's some crisis, when there's some urgent need to do so. And we use the two systems interchangeably. We actually detect anomalies on the Earth, like, oh, that's a fire, that's a smoke plume. We had better see if that wildfire is going on. Oh, there's been this active deforestation. I'm going to show you that in a second. Now, what do we do with all that data? I think we're on the verge of a new era of what we might call planetary AI. And it really breaks down into two huge, combined, and widely distributed projects. The first one is to classify the world. If we think about what made Google as a company, first, they came up with a clever way of indexing web relevance. Then they put that behind the world's easiest to use user interface, and they put an economic engine in the middle. Well, we are in the beginning right now of indexing the Earth. Now, the Earth is wildly many orders of magnitude more complex than the web. The language of the planet, for all of the extraordinary delight that we take in watching generative AI models speak to us in human language, the language of the Earth itself is many orders of magnitude more sophisticated, more nuanced, more complex, more interconnected than the language that any of us speak in this room, no matter how many human languages we speak. But the first step is to begin to index and understand and structure that information, and then wrap large transformer models around it so that we can begin to query it, so we can ask questions of the Earth, so we can be alerted to change and give voice to the planet. That is the exercise that we are collectively involved with in my part of the AI ecosystem. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build the tools that help us get through the narrow path. That is only a narrow path for us to build a more sustainable future. I cannot emphasize, like, when you look at the Earth on a daily basis, it can be hard. It's challenging. The story is more depressing sometimes than what we read about in the newspaper. But again, the tools are more powerful than we could possibly imagine. here's just one example in which way in which we're indexing the Earth. Here is an example of us in blue identifying every building, in red every road, and using supervised machine learning models to identify not just every road or building. Here, I'm going to do it again because they were looking at me instead of looking at the picture, so I'm going to see if I do it again. Okay, one more time. Okay, so this is our offices in San Francisco, and that's every road and building on Earth this week. So that's what AI can do. It can tell you about everywhere. Now, how many people are interested in everywhere? Nobody is interested in everywhere. What you care about is where you live, and you care about what's going on with you. What could you use a tool like that to do? Well, one of the things you can do is not only see where the buildings are, but where they used to be and are no longer. And that happens in war. So one of the things we've been doing with our colleagues at the Microsoft AI for Good laboratory is building a tool for the Secretary General of the United Nations to monitor every single building in Ukraine in real time for damage. Now, some of that has to do with delivering humanitarian aid, and getting civilians off the battlefield, and some of it may have to do with future war crimes prosecutions, and some of it has to do with lots of different elements of rebuilding a whole country after a conflict. But the point is, we've never had that kind of information before, and you can use exactly the same building damage assessment as we have done in countless disasters. In fact, in Lahaina, some of you remember in Hawaii, we had a giant wildfire just blew through. We were able to assess all the building damage while the fires were still ongoing and give that information to the Red Cross so that we got the scarce resource, which is human interest, focus, and action, on the right things at the right time. Oh, no, what did I, yes, sure, this one? The Ukraine one. I'm going to give you, yeah, this is actually a page from the UN report, the internal report that went to Secretary General to show them how we did this, the Office of the SG. And here, working with a group called NASA Harvest, we've been enabling our colleagues. NASA Harvest is the in-house global food security system that NASA stood up. It's a bunch of technical experts in food systems. Here we're monitoring every single crop, every single field in Ukraine in real time to understand the impact of the conflict on the overall productivity of Ukraine, because something that you all might not be aware of is that half of the food aid that's distributed in disasters by the World Food Program, you know, when you ever see people and they're like throwing buckets of wheat off the back of a truck after a natural disaster, 1 in 2 of those bags comes from Ukraine. So we had better understand precisely, not because just that we care about Ukrainians and Ukrainians being able to feed themselves, but the world feeds itself through this important breadbasket. Now, there are many, many other examples. I'm going to give you just a couple in the time that I have left. Now, one of the most important things we have to understand, if we want to understand compound aggregated climate risk in this era of intrinsic fragility and vulnerability, is we have to understand where the people are. So our colleagues at the Microsoft AI for Good Lab and a group called IHME, which produces the world's canonical public health data sets, some of them, based at the University of Washington. We are taking our satellite imagery using AI to extract essential patterns of human habitat and then producing the highest resolution and most up-to-date maps of where human beings live on Earth. And that's hugely important because while many of us live in places where, you know, you open Google Maps and if you get slightly detoured off Google Maps, you go apoplectic, right? We've just so accommodated ourselves to the fact of real-time information that we don't realize that in many places of the world, nothing like it exists. This is a place called Zinder in Niger. It's the 4th largest city in the country. It was last mapped in 2012. Using this technique, we're able to identify all of that stuff in deep purple and new people that live there. So if you want to plan a census or a public health campaign or engage in democracy or any of those kinds of things, you have to, or help people move out of areas of risk. Now, this is really detailed. It gets down to the level of a few meters, actually, in places like, this is in downtown Nairobi around a park. But the thing that's really exciting about this is how these different pieces begin to fit together. When you can use AI to model where all the humans are, then you could layer in the kinds of forcing functions on migration, like food security and disease burden, to begin to understand the things that might radically shift people in an increasingly insecure environment. Now, the next one example I want to give you is from climate change. We work very closely with this extraordinary network of technical organizations called Climate Trace. They're very heavily backed and supported by Al Gore. And what they do is they take all this satellite data and machine learning and AI to identify sources of emissions that come from all over the world. So here's a good example. You know, most of the world's coal-fired power plants are their emissions are not reported by governments because coal is really dirty and there's no obligation to report. But we can actually see through the satellites, these are actually our images, you can see when the coal-fired power plants turn on and off, and they're highly variable. So our colleagues at Climate Trace, what they do is they take all of that imagery. I'm going to zoom in on one that happens to be in Uttar Pradesh, India here. You'll see it in a second. And you'll see a little black squiggly line. That's the trailing one-year climate emissions from that plant as inferred by AI from that deep stack of continuous observation of satellite imagery. And you can see we're doing them all over the world. This is what's really exciting. At the last major climate summit, because this kind of data is what you actually need if you want to negotiate climate negotiations with teeth, is you have to know the truth. You have to know what's really going on. And our colleagues at Climate Trace released this. This is a map of 352 million sources of emissions. It's about 70% of all the emissions, and we hope by the end of next year to have finished the project where we literally have mapped where everything that's contributing to the total climate picture. And new instruments are going to help us even more powerfully. This is a new satellite system that's literally going up in the next few months. They're called tanagers. They see the world, if your eyes see this amount of light in the visible spectrum, these instruments see this amount of light in 420 spectral bands at 5 nanometer separation, if anyone's interested. And what we do with those is they're able to determine and see things that the human eye cannot see. The first canonical use case are point source facilities level emissions of methane. So we can literally say, it's this oil and gas pad, this landfill, this cattle processing plant that is releasing this much emissions. And one of the partners in this effort, including NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory and Planet, is the state of California. Their intention is to make, if we can make seeing emissions dirt cheap with these kinds of tools, they will make ignoring those emissions incredibly expensive for the people who are doing the emitting in the first place. An era of radical climate transparency is being born right now because of the fusion of data and AI in ways that people don't even see, but will become commonplace in the next 10 years. Okay. I want to show you just a really quick example. This is what deforestation looks like deep in the Amazon. Now, most of you, if you're like me, your eye is drawn to what's happening on the right-hand side of the screen. By the way, I've sped up a few weeks of deforestation. This is straight out of the instruments. This is a few weeks of deforestation sped up so you can see it in a few seconds. Now, what your eye might not have been drawn to is what happens on the left-hand side of that screen, which is right after that deforestation occurs, you see these little spider webs that are coming out. Those are the illegal roads that go in before the next round of deforestation occurs. And what I'm going to show you is what the future looks like of AI-powered policy. We have built tools that allow us to identify, using machine learning, where those roads are as they're emerging. So what you're seeing here are detectors. This is not a human analysis. These are 2 images a month apart that have found this illegal road. Then our colleagues down in Brazil, a partner organization, takes all of that capability, and they built this tool for the Brazilian government that identifies every act of deforestation as it's occurring and produces automated reports that are then vetted by a human being and occasionally turned into warrants, not fines, warrants. The Brazilian environmental police, in just the last 12 months, have deployed more than 4,000 agents and more than 150 joint operations. They've gone into the field where they find the machines that are creating those illegal roads and they blow them up. And then they fine and jail the people engaged in it. They've collected more than $3 billion worth of fines and asset seizures with people who are involved in this activity. And they've reduced the rates of deforestation in Brazil by 50% year on year. They cut it by 50% because they were able to get a signal from the Earth filtered through the tools we've been talking about all day that allows them to take effective action as fast as the action is occurring. That's what I was telling you about at the beginning. And in the process, they generated this one particular system. If you ever want like a really good number, you know a project has succeeded when outside people tell you that it has generated 8,490% return on investment. That is a very good number. Now, I want to spend just a couple minutes. I know I'm a little, first of all, does anyone need to pee? Y'all still with me? Could we go like a couple more minutes? Because I just got a couple cool more things I want to show you, and then you got to, okay, just clap for them, and also clap for the crew, because the crew's had an incredibly long day, and has done an unbelievable job for everybody that's here. Thank you for the extra 5 minutes that you're about to give me. Okay, so this is really exciting, but very bespoke. And the question is, what comes next? Well, I want to show you this other example here. Here I'm going to show you a tool, which, I'm sorry, if you guys could go back, I'm going to just redo it, because I want you to see it from the beginning. Here's a tool in which we've taken all the satellite imagery around this area in Russia, and we allow an end user, this is an organization called Synthetic. They specialize in this, in which we're going to identify a ship. And what we want to find are all the ships everywhere along that coastline. And what happens is, first, there's a lot of pre-computation that's happening of these particular tiles. This particular ship has, now we've gone out and found all the self-similar boats that are in the region. Now, the thing is, the universe of things that look like ships includes things that are not ships. So what the next part you're seeing over here happen on the right is that cloud of self-similarities being correlated, and then someone's going to go in and draw a polygon around the things that are the real ships that they're interested in, and instantaneously see all the ships. So if you're interested in illegal fishing, can you imagine what tool this allows us, what this allows us to do? It allows us to take seriously the idea that we're actually in charge of the planet, that we're the apex predators, that we have an obligation as that kind of species to take better care of the entire web of life. This is the tool that allows us to do it. And I'd just be curious if anyone happens to know what this is. This is produced with exactly the same tool. Anybody know what this is? Well, I live in the United States. We had a large balloon of foreign origin float over our country recently. And this tool, because we're collecting all the information every day backwards, allows you to do exactly what I just did with the boats, but find all the balloons and trace them backwards to their point of origin. So you can imagine how many people from a national security might be interested in perspective, and it might be interested in that kind of thing. But I want to show you one last example here before I show you the very last bit of this, which is what happens when you attach this to these large models. So here is an example where we take just that kind of information about California, and we begin to ask questions in plain English like, what was the temperature in Sacramento, the average temperature? Or we just did it for the state of California, so we just want to begin to query in plain English. And what we find is that this is the thing that takes all of this data out of the data science and library science era and begins to put it in ordinary people's hands. It's the search bar moment that we are all living through collectively. We are all collectively authoring different versions of the same thing. Now, it's important, as was said before on this stage just a few minutes ago, first, that there's a data sovereignty issue, that we have to make sure that this is done inclusively, that there are open source competitors to commercial providers. One of the most interesting new foundational models I'll just point out is this thing called Clay. If you go to madewithclay.org, you can begin to check it out. It's a foundational model for Earth observation data. And where does this go next? Okay, these things are happening now. I just want to share with you the stuff that makes me most excited. The first one is taking all of this different kinds of information from the ground, from the air, from space, beginning to fuse it together in a way that enables us to understand life itself, to understand biodiversity. There's a new technology called eDNA. That eDNA data is literally field samples taken at a watering hole, lets you see the DNA, the leftover DNA of all the creatures that have wandered through that particular area. And beginning to use these machine learning tools to extrapolate where we have DNA, site-specific, and we have satellite imagery, and we have camera traps to be able to really understand what's going on ecologically so that we can protect the most vulnerable places on Earth. If you are interested in that little QR code has a white paper that we, Microsoft, Stanford, a whole bunch of people worked together on to actually describe how that works. Now, this is in Tanzania, and these are my last couple slides, I promise. This is in Tanzania, where The Earth has been denuded of life because of agricultural development, because of conflict, because of poor stewardship. And when that happens, the Earth develops a kind of like a drum-like skin. And even when it rains, the water doesn't seep into the soil. It just evaporates back off. And water is the substance of life. If you don't have water, you don't get to regreen. And we need to restore the world. What's fascinating is what you're seeing here are these approaches building something called buns. They can literally be built with ordinary shovels and human labor, and they allow for that surface drum to be punctured so that water can get into the soil. And we can actually see from space, we can actually track, it's a little hard to see here, but there's a little white outline in the center of the left-hand thing where we're doing, this is a study area, and you can actually watch that area get greener. Over the last 3.5 years, this area has become 50% more greener, it's reduced in temperature, and the soil's become far more capable of holding moisture, which is about restoration, not just sustainability. It's not about ending the film strip of doom, it's about restoring the planet to a place of its original richness, or at least something approximating it. When you have tools like that, you can begin to incentivize them. And that's really the biggest structural thing that's in front of us today. You know, capital markets have produced enormous wealth for at least some people, most people, but wildly and varyingly. Capitalism is very good for some people, it's been pretty good for some people, it's been not so great for some people. But one thing we know is that ever since modern capitalism got started, it's had a couple of basic things that it has ignored. And one of them is it's tended to treat nature as self-abundant, hyper-abundant, self-replenishing, and free. So if you bespoil the river, you just move your factory to the next river until you run out of rivers. And when we were writing the original book of capitalism, it was okay because we had more rivers than we could possibly, we didn't even know where all the rivers are. Well, that's not true anymore, right? Now, we live in a different world, but that world that's interesting is a world in which the company Amazon, if you could put the slides up for a second, the company Amazon gets measured, and because it's valuable, billions of times a day. Could you throw my slides up? That'd be great. But the actual Amazon, for which it's named, has no intrinsic economic value until you cut the trees down. Okay? That's bullshit. That's got to change. AI is actually one of the most powerful tools because of the thing I just showed you before. Okay, last slide. I just want to leave you with this idea. I represent a team of smarter people than myself working on this tirelessly day after day after day. Okay, people who get up every day and trying to figure out how do we adjust these systems, how do we begin to take these things that are externalities and move them into systems, like moving them into capital systems. But I want to leave you with a kind of metaphor. Scientists ask this very basic question. Why do birds and bees and fish and humans, plenty of insect species, why do we swarm together? Why do we flock together? Why? Because if you've ever seen those like slow-moving schools of fish, you're like, hey, that's a pretty good meal for a shark, right? That does not look like a wise move if you're a little fish in an environment where there's lots of bigger fish. And the best hypothesis we have for why animals do this, including human beings, is what's called the many eyes hypothesis. It posits that the reason we come together is that when we're close together, but our views overlap but are not exactly the same. So when we have many eyes on the environment, our collective safety is raised. And you can see that when you see a big fish swim through a school of fish and they all go like this. What makes those fish capable of doing that is that they all have overlapping points of view on the environment and they are strongly connected to each other. That is the most important thing. So it's not enough to build these wonderful maps. It's important to distribute them so that we have collective safety. And that is the job that all of us are here to do in the next 10 years, so that there will be a civilization that our children and our children's children want to enjoy in the next 100. Thanks. Have a great day. This was a good conference, and you are heroes for staying with us.
Thank you so much. Wow, the wonderful and fascinating Andrew Zolli there. Hope you enjoyed that. But that was our last keynote of the day. Thank you for sticking with us. And we are very much looking forward to seeing you again tomorrow.